Hello. Today's video will be a review and benchmark of this very nice looking Compaq LTE 7740. This is a vintage laptop that comes with a Pentium MMX processor and slightly different configurations. That was released, I think, around 1996, if I remember correctly. And it has many features that you will appreciate and some drawbacks that you should be aware of. Alright, so first of all, let me show you how the laptop looks. Despite its size, it's quite a compact laptop for its time. It is somewhat surprising because it's quite heavy. I think that the way in which it's configured is quite well, but it has some drawbacks. So first of all, let me show you, this is the front side of the laptop. You can see the status indicators or power on, battery, hard drive activity, and I think the last one may be for the PCMCIA slot, but I'm not entirely sure. Over here you have the disk drive caddy that can be accessed from the outside. You just have to unscrew here and you have access to it, and the floppy disk drive. Well, unfortunately the drawbacks are not entirely apparent, but they are going to be immediately felt. Despite the laptop's good configuration, this unit has a belt driven platter, which means that you will certainly find it unusable, and it's quite difficult to find a replacement belt and have a reliable product. I'm not entirely sure why on a slightly upper mid-range laptop you would still see this very cheap option. So first of all, don't have high expectations for a working floppy disk drive, because I think they are not going to be justified. So let's move on. Over here you have the access to the two PCMCIA slots. They are type 2, type 3. In here I have already entered an extension card that works, hopefully, because this is another issue. It's an USB PCMCIA card that works quite well, but unfortunately I have to say that it doesn't work in every laptop. There seems to be an issue with compatibility pertaining to interrupt requests and other resources allocation. So this means that it's not a given that you can use such a unit easily, such an extension on your laptop. Unfortunately, with this laptop it's highly required, because first of all the floppy disk drive is not going to be usable. I do not have a CD-ROM drive, so transferring files to the system would require me to take out the hard drive and transfer files externally, which is not that convenient. And the third reason would be that for convenience it's unmatched by any other solution. And of course the laptop doesn't have a USB 2 port. I don't know exactly what is the reason for Compaq's legacy of not doing so. I don't know what were the reasons, but certainly we have this situation. The infrared port, which was typical on many laptops of this time, the microphone input, the headphone or line output, and the line input. This was typical on most laptops of that time. You are not going to find one that is not going to have these features, so it's quite standard. The serial port, the printer port, an extension port or a docking port. I have not seen the docking station, but I'm entirely sure that there was such an option. The PS2 port, which should be able to run with both a keyboard and a mouse, the VGA output, and the power supply input. Actually, this is important because the power supply is integrated in the laptop. This may be one of the reasons why the laptop is slightly heavier than you would expect for such a unit. However, it's very well designed. I have to say that this feature was also present on some Toshiba laptops of that time, particularly a Satellite Pro series that was released roughly around that time. So it wasn't entirely unexpected for a laptop, but it was a good feature. Of course, it's a power supply that can operate both on 100 volt countries and on ones that are supplied up to 240. So it's going to be highly useful. Over here we have another very interesting feature. We have some legs that could be used to slightly lift the chassis. Although they may not survive rough usage, I think that it's a nice feature and goes on to show that this was certainly an above mid-range product, even if you may not find that feature entirely useful. Speakers. The laptop has two speakers, but I think that they are not going to be entirely visible. This is not the speaker output, this is just the fan output. The fan is quite small. I don't know how much noise it makes, I do not remember it that well, but I think it's not going to be overly obnoxious. In general, laptops of this time had quite reasonable heat sinking and heat carrying capacity. Of course, the latches that open and close the lid, which seem to have survived quite well on this model, and I think they may be able to survive others as well. And I think that this is roughly what you can find on the laptop. Of course, with these laptops, there was an option of having a CD-ROM drive. This unit doesn't have it. However, this was possible to be supplied, and of course the disk drive can be replaced with the CD-ROM drive. So if you want to use the floppy or the CD-ROM, it's very easy to swap them. Alright, so I will be preparing to start the unit, and I will be back just in a moment. Unfortunately, in the case of this unit, as soon as you plug in, the power is going to start. I don't know exactly what happens and what is the reason for this behavior, but it's entirely obvious that this happens. Alright, so let me see if I can have a better look for the screen, but first of all I have to change the brightness so that it's not going to be overly annoying. I have to say that first of all, the laptop keyboard is very nice. I think it's one of the nicest keyboards you're going to find out of many laptops, and I cannot stress it enough, because many laptops seem to have a major compromise in terms of keyboard feel, keycaps quality, the membrane. It's certain that there are many shortcomings of having such a compact keyboard. However, even in this situation, there are very good and very bad examples. This one is a very good example, and I think that it's important to note that. All right. So the menu system is quite nice. I think it's one of the nicest you're going to find in a laptop of this time, even if it's not going to control perhaps as you would expect. So first of all, the function key shortcuts, and I'm going to reduce the brightness. This is mainly to have a good balance between the screen, the contrast, the black levels. I could have gone with full blast in brightness. However, I have noticed that the slight glow that may be obvious in certain situations may not look that good on the camera. So from my experience, I will try to make it look like that. All right. First of all, let's try and see if I can make the screen look any better. But first of all, start an application so that I have something to work with. All right. I think that the screen looks quite nice with good focus. So I think we will let it as is. So first of all, what is the current laptop's configuration? Compaq supplied many laptops with different specifications. I think that the most important difference between them is the supplied Pentium processor. It would have been as slow as a Pentium 150 megahertz or as high as a 266 megahertz processor. In this case, there is a bit of variability. Of course, performance increases significantly from the lowest to the highest rating. Unfortunately, the difference is not going to be that much, because with the old Pentium generation, the Pentium technology, performance scaling is not going as much as the clock rate increases. So there are going to be some shortcomings. Overall, however, with a Pentium MMX and with one that is roughly at 166, I think that you are hitting bullseye. You are reaching a very good position for retro computing, because you have enough power to run most games that were not requiring extensive 3D capabilities, and especially software rendering titles. Anything that runs on DOS roughly from that time is going to work entirely perfect, and the laptop is going to feel very fast, smooth in most operations. So I think that it's a good balance. Of course, there are some shortcomings. There may be older games released in 1992 or 1993 that may not run perfectly. However, in practice, I can say that the problems you're going to encounter are quite minimal. So it's a sweet spot to have a Pentium processor in that range. All right, moving on. Next, the laptop was supplied with 16 megabytes or 32 megabytes either RAM on board. The memory that was on board is certainly a very good choice, because you already have something with your laptop. There are many laptops that are available on the market and that do not have any memory, because those extension cards have been taken out of the system. So this means that you're going to find very or much more difficult a laptop computer that may be having the certainty of being supplied with something and usable right away. This also creates the possibility of having more memory, and particularly this is important if you find an extension module available on the laptop, or one that could be supplied separately. But in general, you don't have to have high hopes. If it has it, very nice. If it's not and it doesn't seem to be compatible, then probably it's not a good choice. However, you can bump the memory up to 128 or as high as 144, depending on the onboard memory, with two 64 megabytes modules. And I think that to that you can add the onboard memory, so you can reach quite high capacities easily. So this is a very good configuration. In general, I think that 128 megabytes is overkill for a Pentium 1. Probably 64 megabytes is the most you could probably ever have a use for, and 32 megabytes is roughly on the limit, at least if you're going to try Windows 98. If you're just working with those games, I think that 16 megabytes may be just fine, or with older versions of Windows such as Windows 95 or Windows 3.1. All right. The next major feature of this laptop is the screen. if you look closely on it, and I think you can certainly guess at certain aspects from the camera, from the way it looks, I think it's one of the best displays. I don't know exactly what kind of backlight they used, or if it was a special LCD or not. However, it looks very nice in person. It has many attributes that have been wisely chosen. First of all, the screen is quite large in this case. The screen could have been 12.1 or 14 inches. I think this one is a 12.1 inches screen, but it looks very nice. Very good contrast, very good color reproduction. So you're going to enjoy a lot of games or applications running in this case. Even if the resolution is 800 by 600 and maybe slightly lower to your expectations, I can clearly say that again, this is spot on. With such an old Pentium processor and with video cards that were typical back then, ones that had around 2 megabytes of memory, anything that requires more speed in full resolution is not going to work properly. So I think that again it's a very good choice. Having just 640 by 480 resolution is a bit low, and anything above 800 by 600 I think is overkill, because you're going to have very low performance, at least in this range. So keep that in mind, and I think that you're going to have a very good spot. Next, the video card. The video card is quite unique in certain ways. I think that there were very few laptops that actually used an S3 graphics chipset. For many enthusiasts that work with older Pentium processor computers, especially the desktop units, the S3 Frio64 and derivatives of that model and technology are very popular. And in many ways they had very good compatibility, they had great ability to run most games, and they had good acceleration. So it's quite a surprise to see this kind of chipset in a laptop, because there were very few manufacturers that chosen such a system. Chips and Tech adapters were very popular, just as well the Trident ones, some Cirrus Logic, and I think that this roughly covers most of the chipsets that were used on this computer. So having an S3 graphics is going to be very interesting, because you can make a cross comparison. However, don't have high hopes, because I think that, as far as I remember from running some tests, it's not that far from other chipset adapters. So anyone that can have high expectations should be having ones that are slightly diminished, because it's not going to be that big of a deal to have an S3 graphics adapter in this case. However, compatibility is very good, and I think that this is going to be appreciated. Next, it's a Sound Blaster emulation. It's an ASS chipset, so again another very good choice. ASS 1878. This again strikes a very good balance, because even if it's not a native Sound Blaster chipset, it has very good emulation, and particularly OPL-free synthesizes capability. And this is much more important for certain games and the way in which you are going to enjoy them. And ultimately, of course, compared with Crystalware solutions, I think that ASS was much better in this respect. Of course, we are talking about old technology, so sound output may not be as good as more modern laptops, and of course you have to take into account the inherent wear and tear that happens with other models. And the hard drive being supplied was between 1.6 and 5 gigabytes. This hard drive is 6 gigabytes. It was much higher end from another laptop model that I replaced the original one because the original one simply went off. I don't remember if it was a Toshiba branded one or a Fujitsu or any other brand. However, I can clearly say that this laptop supports well hard drives that were of quite higher capacity than it was initially supplied. So compatibility again is good. Alright, let's run some benchmarks and I will tell you along the way what are my other expectations. This one I think is not going to show any kind of result. Okay, 25 frames per second, but this doesn't work 25 frames per second because the benchmark has some issues, but I'm just running them so that you can have a very good understanding of the laptop's capabilities. Alright, this one I think is going to show a much more reliable answer and I'm expecting more than 60 frames per second. Yes, okay, 115 frames per second. It looks very smooth. In general, this one would have been a good test for some 486 laptops and particularly for 386 ones. So I think that this is the most important reason for your let's say benchmark forays. Alright, this one looks perfect. If you remember correctly, seeing such a test running on a passive metric screen is going to look simply horrible because of the very low response time. 106 frames per second is perfect. It's not running, as far as I can tell, in very high resolution, but it's going to be enough. I don't remember exactly it's 320 or not, but we are going to have immediately a very good example because PCP benchmark is going to run in high resolution. So seeing this test running at 640 by 400 is going to show you exactly what the laptop is capable of. And I think it runs quite fine. I mean, this SVGA resolution is not a problem for a laptop with such a configuration. The video chipset particularly is fast. Don't expect fantastic performance because again, the rest of the system is not that fast, but however, it's good. It's roughly in line with a typical Neo Magic chipset you would use. 15 frames per second, so it's quite playable if you want to run probably Quake in high resolution. It's borderline playable, but think about it. Most games that we're running with on such computers are not that unpleasant to work with in this context. So keep that in mind. With a modern game, 15 frames per second is not going to be much. With older games, consistent frame rate is much more attainable. This benchmark is very interesting for a couple of reasons. As I have mentioned on other laptops, it shows a lot of performance data. You can see how fast the memory can work, the video chipset, and as you can see, it's a bit over 10 megabytes per second. It's not much, but remember that anything that is at least 10 megabytes throughput capable means that you're not going to have any issue running all 320 by 200, so standard resolution, those games, and even some games that are for 640 by 480, so SVGA games. This test can get stuck, can freeze at certain moments on certain computers. I don't know exactly what is the reason. This is why I skipped one of the memory tests. It's not going to matter. I'm going to do the same over here as well because the throughput tests are still going to be present and the values are very interesting, even if the transfer speed cannot be determined. This one would have looked at the performance on the L1 cache, L2 cache, and the memory transfer. So it's not that important. However, 300 something megabytes per second is a very good speed for the L1 cache. L2 at roughly half the size because it's not going to respond as quickly, but it's also going to be much higher in capacity, and the memory throughput that is roughly expected to be around 66 megahertz, because we are talking about add-on memory, and this is the bus speed. So if you really want to dwell a lot and think about why all these values are as is, you can have this. And ultimately, as mentioned, it's quite a good performance chipset. You're not going to have many issues. Even if I run some software, as you can see, the fan has not kicked in. So cooling is quite nice. It may kick in later, but anyway, this is the situation. All right, one short mention. The chipset is branded as S3 Aurora. It doesn't matter because it's the same chipset that was created for the 3064 desktop graphics adapters. So roughly the performance is not going to be that bad. Okay, let's run other benchmarks. I'm not expecting anything spectacular because ultimately this is quite a fast laptop. As you can see, the information is roughly used only as a reference, nothing else, nothing more. This is made for very old laptops, probably ones that were near the first 8086 and the 286 processors. So anything that is faster than that is actually much too fast for let's say good information. You may see some glitches over here, but they are mostly due to the fact that I run another application, and another application can make some let's say glitches appear in the video, but this is not a problem. We are not having any serious annoyance over that. So the performance is roughly what you would expect. It's a 166 processor. It's massively faster than Pentium at 66 megahertz. All right, the next test. Again, it may not be entirely accurate, but it's going to be enough for our purposes. As you can see, roughly it can reach a performance of 233 megahertz processor. I'm not entirely sure why, because it's on 166. I'm not taking this result too seriously. And I think that now we can get to the very interesting ones that rely on games, because when you purchase such a laptop or when you receive one, you want to know how well it runs Doom and Quake. Well, Doom is not really a challenge. Ultimately, we are talking about a computer that is much faster than the minimum requirements for Doom. So actually, you're not going to see any sort of problem doing so. I mean, a 486 runs perfectly fine. As you can see, the frame rate is very high, so no issues over here. And the screen looks fantastic. I have to again mention the screen. All right. The next one is going to be obviously Quake, because right now we are talking about a game that really uses most of the performance that can be present on the laptop. It's running in standard resolution, so that's not an issue. Sorry. I have to say that the sound is very nice for a laptop with such small speakers. I have seen much worse examples, so that's not an issue. I can probably brighten the screen a bit so that it looks better on the camera. I think this one is enough. It looks fantastic in person, I can clearly say that. All right, let's run the demo. Okay. In terms of performance, I'm expecting clearly something better than 30 frames per second. It looks consistently above that. it may reach, I don't know, 40 frames per second with certain drops in places, but this is more than enough for running Quake in 320 by 200 resolution, the standard one. Okay, let's see the result. 32 frames per second. Yes, quite close on the mark. In general, you're not going to find major disappointments with such a configuration. I mean, a Pentium 166 offers plenty of performance. The only potential slowdown would be due to the video chipset, particularly in the case of Cirrus Logic and some older Trident models. But with a chipset Neomagic or S3 chipset, you're not going to find issues there. Alright, just for the sake of it, I can change the display resolution. I can go, or at least I could attempt to do that. It's surprising because SVGA modes are not present, and most laptops would at least be expected to present such a feature. But it goes on to show that the Aurora and the Frio models were slightly different in terms of implementation. So in this case, VESA modes are not present. So I cannot show you any kind of test in this respect. Alright. Let's move further. I think that it's useful to also show you another benchmark. I don't know if it's going to have an issue or not, so I'm going to reboot the system. It's safer that way. This system has 48 megabytes of RAM. It has a single 32 megabytes memory module and 16 megabytes of RAM on board. And of course it runs Windows 98 as well. So let's run that benchmark that I wanted to show to you. I think this one is the most reliable benchmark you're going to see in many ways, because it has so much information it can convey through various tests it makes, as well as a lot of information pertaining to the performance, because ultimately it also has benchmarking capabilities. So if you're going to look at the video, you're going to see the chipset's name. So as I said, it's a true S3 graphics, a true and rare S3 graphics chipset. It's very nice, with 2 megabytes of memory, as far as I can tell. I can look again, but I think yes. And although it says that it supports VESA VBA, as you have seen in Quake, this may not be entirely using standard means. I don't know exactly if you have to run a terminated state resident program or not. However, you cannot use it that way. And of course, we can see the multimedia capability, the Sound Blaster 2 emulation, a very solid one, as you have seen. Keep in mind that I have not run any sort of terminated state resident program for the Sound Blaster capability. So what you have heard in Quake is just using the standard configuration. This is another advantage, especially for retro enthusiasts that are not so used to tinkering with settings in the configuration files of DOS. So ultimately this is again another very good feature. Alright, let's run the benchmarks. As you can see, it's right on the mark. It's a Pentium 166 processor and it runs as expected. Okay, let's also run the floating point unit test. It is slightly below a Pentium 166 MHz processor. I don't know exactly what is the reason for this performance, but it's not that far off. So you can clearly say that if you have a desktop unit and this laptop, you can probably compare quite well the situation and not have let's say disappointments when running certain games. Okay, I think that's enough with this test, so we will be looking at some other games. But of course, just because this test, this benchmark may create certain configuration glitches, I'm just choosing to make a reboot. Alright, what else I should say? The track point is fantastic in certain ways, because the original rubberized cap is still present over here, and it runs perfectly. It's a surprise because in most laptops those are either damaged, as it happens with most models, or they simply disintegrate because the rubber component degrades so much that it gets mushy. This has not happened, so quite good manufacturing capability. Of course, this one may be slightly higher or lower on different laptop series, so it was not a given that a certain manufacturer would be consistent in this respect. Alright, I will show you some traditional games that I think are going to be quite interesting. I'm not going to run Duke 3D because I think it's not going to offer any sort of information in this case. You can roughly think at Duke Nukem 3D performance as somewhere in between a Doom and a Quake running installation. So running it in 640 by 480 is going to be possible, and probably you're going to enjoy the game that way. I will show you some other games that may have certain issues. One of the most obvious ones is Lotus. Lotus sometimes cannot run on certain systems due to the fact that it requires probably particular CPU configuration. You're going to notice the game having issues on I think 300 something megahertz processors. Of course, the game was released when processors like the 286 and 386 were the most popular. As far as I can tell, this game runs perfectly fine. I'm not expecting any sort of issues, slowdowns, or glitches, because again, we are talking about an S3 graphics chipset, but this was similar with most other chipsets. I don't think you're going to find any sort of glitches with older games like this. And the same goes for Doom. It's just a too simple graphics routine to have issues. And the music, as you have heard, the ad-lib music sounds perfectly fine. Alright, another very good game for those, besides Quake, that obviously I'm going to run, Wolfenstein 3D. Wolfenstein 3D in general also doesn't pose any sort of challenges. The configuration is solid. As you have seen, I have not done anything, and you can already hear the sound effects and the music. Okay, I think it runs just perfect, and with a screen that is so fine, really you're going to enjoy a lot playing the game over here. I'm not entirely sure if there is a way to for some scaling. There may be some sort of workarounds for that. However, I think that running it like this in the letterbox mode, but with native pixel display, is very good. Alright, I'm going to show you a comparison between 640 and 320 resolution. I am not entirely sure if it's going to work, but I will make this attempt. Speed Haste is quite a bad game in many respects. Although it looks quite good, the gameplay is going to be seriously bad for many reasons. It's mostly an unfinished game that was sold as shareware, but that is the situation. Right now it runs in 640 by 480 resolution. It's somewhat playable, and this is due to the graphics chipset. But it may not be entirely as pleasant as if you run the game in standard VGA or MCGA resolution of the 320 by 200. However, due to the graphics capability and compatibility, in this case you're not going to see problems. I'm not entirely sure what is the reason for the card's inability to be directly recognized in Quake, but I assume that there is a reason for this as well. Okay, we can change the graphics resolution and go to the standard one. and in this case you're going to notice perfect performance with no other issues. As you can see, the performance is simply perfect, very smooth gameplay. Of course, you're not going to think about too many polygons over here, and the racing surface is flat. The AI players are going to have horrible behavior, so it's not going to be a real demand on the processor. But however, the resolution issue is important because it performance scales quite easy due to the fact that it's not much that takes place between one situation and the other. Hacking is another very interesting game. Most of the time when you're trying to run it on modern systems, you're going to have issues. Running it with slower processors is not going to be pleasant, so 133 MHz processor is a must. As you can see over here, this animation runs perfectly smooth, so I'm expecting gameplay to be perfect. However, running it with very fast processors is going to be unusable on certain resolutions. In this case, with a 320 by 200 resolution, it's entirely controllable, no issues. However, if you're going to switch to 640 by 480, it may feel slightly slow, but this is the way things are. As you can see, the frame per second performance has dropped severely, and I'm not expecting when running the game to be very good. Yes, as you can see. All right. Let's move further and see another game. Actually, I'm going to change the resolution back to normal. Okay, I'm going to quit. And show you Quake, because ultimately I think that you are quite interested in how Quake actually runs. You have seen the performance of 30 frames per second is actually very good. I'm not expecting any sort of issues. In here I think I have used an even higher resolution, so this may be useful to know. Let's see. 360 by 240. You may be wondering why to do such to use such a resolution. In this case, it's a good compromise, because if I'm trying to run the game at higher resolution, I cannot. If I'm running it in the standard resolution, it doesn't fill the screen enough. So having this in between option is much better than just relying on the 320 by 200 resolution. It's a good compromise, ultimately. It fills the screen more as a 640 by 400 display frame or display page. Okay, let's go and show you how the game runs. It runs actually very nice. I will change a bit the brightness just so that it looks slightly better on the camera, sorry. Although this one isn't bad in the least, okay? And if you are going, it's perfectly smooth. As you can see, no problems at all. I'm expecting a slightly lower performance than 30 frames per second, probably 25 or 28, but it's entirely perfect for running it and actually enjoying the game. As you can see, absolutely no issues. And over here, when we are already seeing other enemies, no, there isn't any sort of problem, so you can enjoy it a lot. All right, next I think we are going to run the Windows software suite, software benchmarking suite, because we have already seen what we want. Just so we avoid any sort of issues, I'm going to reboot the system. All right, let's see. I have to say first of all that this is not an issue. Even if you see this error, you have to take into account another important aspect. Windows 3.1 may have some issues detecting part of the configuration, and you have to use all sorts of workarounds in order to be able to run both Windows 3.1, 3.11, Windows for Workgroups, and Windows 98. So this compromise leads to certain errors, but you don't have to mind them too much. There is going to be some performance degradations, but that's life. I'm not using any sort of discussion program because it would take memory and slightly create some issues in certain games. So it's going to be slightly slow. But after Windows starts, you're not going to see that much of an issue unless you transfer files. But since in general I'm not doing this, it's not going to be a problem. All right, let's start the typical benchmarking suite. This test has been consistent in the sense that it offers both reliable results that are highly stable and also results that reveal a lot in terms of performance. So what I'm seeing in this test is going to be very important for how I'm going to assess the particular configuration I'm seeing. The CAD test is particularly CPU speed sensitive test, and also one that uses certain graphics capabilities. Not all video cards can take advantage of this, so performance may not be as high. In this case, performance is great. Think about it. Anything that goes over 200 with a system of this, with this processor, with 166, clearly shows that it's a very good display drive and hardware configuration. Over here 132, this is more in line with expectations. In general, it's very hard to achieve a very high result on this test. But something that is above 100 means that you're going to enjoy clearly using this configuration. Over here I'm expecting over 100, so pretty good, perhaps even higher than that. Yes, 168. It's a very good performance, it's a reliable one. Over here, just because it starts something from the disk is not going to affect that much performance. Over here you notice, however, a slightly lower performance than 100, which is a bit surprising, but other than that, there is not an issue. Think about the fact that most chipset had their strengths and weaknesses. I don't think you can find a graphics chipset that consistently is very high performing, offers very good performance in all these tests. In general, there is some sort of compromise that happens. However, Neo-Magic chipsets are known for having very good performance. So if you're looking at comparisons between S3 graphics and other chipsets, clearly the Neo-Magic one is the one to have. And particularly the later Neo-Magic chipset had tremendous performance for 2D functions. Alright, I think this one has shown enough. Alright, I think that we will be looking further at Windows 98. For performance reasons again, and in order to avoid any sort of issues, I'm going to reboot the system. Even if I could probably run Windows 98 and there may not be any sort of issue, I don't want to risk having certain slowdowns. In case you are wondering, again, I'm using these power saving features in order to potentially reduce the amount of heat and make some sort of reduction in the wear of the laptop's internal parts. So I'm not entirely sure how much it saves, but if it does something in this respect, I don't think it's bad. Windows 98 runs very well. Again, it's quite a fast processor, the memory is enough, so there are not going to be any issues. The beautiful Windows 98 loading sound. Alright, so I'm going to let the system load and I'm going to show you one tool that may be useful. I have let most of the configuration run mostly stock so that you can enjoy it. The only addition is the rain program that makes sure the processor runs idle commands when it's not doing anything else, potentially again reducing the load and heat that is exerted by the processor. Okay. As you can see, almost half of the memory, less than half of the memory is being used. Just 2 megabytes of cache is being allocated. Actually, you don't need to have more in this configuration. I think that most of the memory should be preserved for other purposes, no swap file, and it runs quite well. Of course, this is a custom configuration. If you were using just the standard Windows installation, the disk cache would go up and down just as the swap file in order to accommodate certain Windows requirement. But this makes it slightly slower in these circumstances, so this is why I'm using a fixed configuration. And the amount of memory available is plenty. As I said, 32 megabytes is enough to run Windows 98, not perfectly enough, and anything above that is going to offer enough flexibility. Okay, let's learn some benchmarks. Despite people considering Sandra as being a very good benchmark, I think that the most reliable one or the most easy to run remains the test CPU program that I'm going to show you. Because it can run both on very new and modern versions of Windows and processors, and it can run as well with processors as old as a 486 and even in Windows 95. So it creates a benchmarking capability that can be fully exploited on various platforms, and I think that this cross-referencing is actually very important. The program was released in 1999, so if you don't have other computers running modern processors, you would have to rely on adding data as needed. I'm not aware if there is some sort of database that has more modern processors, but this is enough. There is a certain issue over here, and I'm not entirely sure if it's due to the display's graphic drivers. There should have been some lines on this particular graph over here that are not visible in order to signal where each of these values presents itself. But that's not an issue. As you can see over here, performance is highly consistent. It's actually spot on with a Pentium 166 processor, and I'm expecting the same performance to be also on other commands. So you're going to have very reliable performance. The calculations test is going to take some time, but I'm expecting it to perform again spot on with a Pentium 166 processor. Okay, 12 seconds, and I think that we are very close to, yes, the same performance. Actually, you cannot ask for more with this configuration. And if you're looking over here again, you're seeing very consistent performance. So yes, slightly higher or lower is actually within the margin of error and let's say system variability. So I'm not expecting anything to be below capabilities. So very good performance. Let's see if I also can show you something else. I think this is a very good game to show capabilities, Need for Speed 2, because in general any sort of issue running this game is going to present itself quite clearly. Need for Speed 2 depends first of all on the graphics capability, and it's going to be felt clearly with video cards that do not have enough performance. As you can see over here, it's lying slightly slower than expected, and I do not think that when it's going to be in the game it will be any higher than that. So that's a good indication that this may not be particularly the best video card to play this game. Slightly slower, playable, not far from what I remember using a 3064 video card, but running at less than 15 frames per second or something similar to that value is not that fun. So I'm not recommending it to run with this configuration. I think that you would require at least a 200 something Pentium processor and a slightly better graphics chipset to enjoy this game. Okay, I think I've shown you enough over here. You cannot expect much even if you change the tracks or change the settings, because it's ultimately a game that depends very much on other aspects. Alright, I think that Ignition is another good game. Running it in 320 by 200 or the standard resolution, I think is going to be the best choice. You can probably run the game in 640 by 400 resolution, but I think that is a waste. Why? First of all, because it will be running very slow, as you can see, as you saw previously on Need for Speed 2 Special Edition. In general, anything that runs poor on these games is going to be readily obvious. As you can see over here, I think it's the 640 by 400 resolution. It's not entirely playable, as you can see. There is some slowdown. Of course, the game also slows when there is some loading that takes place, but ultimately the low frame rate is going to make gameplay quite unpleasant. So I think it goes on to show again that you need to have quite lower expectations when you're using such a card. Probably it's a bit slower than a 3064 card as far as I can tell, because I remember playing these games with Pentium 140 Pentium 120 MHz system, desktop system, and it ran probably slightly better in Need for Speed 2. So this is a good indication that the graphics performance may not be entirely up to par with a 364 installation. On the other hand, with the performance on Ignition, I think is quite reliable. It wasn't that spectacular either on that system. But the difference, I think, that is nothing more than 1 or 2 frames per second more in Need for Speed than here. So it's not much. Again, the expectations you have on a desktop system are not going to be quite as much affected by this. Right, so I think that this wraps up nicely what I said about the system. I think that it's quite a well-performing one. The only drawbacks I have are related to the lack of an USB port and of course the horrible choice for floppy disk drive. I mean, direct drive floppy disk drives have been available for many years, but still some manufacturers chose back then not to use them. Okay, let's go here. And make a transfer, because I promised I'm going to show you also the USB adapter performance. I'm not expecting performance to be that bad, however, and I'm not expecting it to be perfect either. Okay, we are waiting. And right now, let's make the transfer. Yeah, that's not a good choice. I should have transferred more files, and perhaps this one is going to work better. Just because I wanted more files and better capability, so that you can see how fast the transfer actually happens. We are transferring about 500 megabytes in probably something like 10 minutes. So 8 minutes, 7 minutes. Okay, let's say that 8 minutes is a good benchmark. So this means around 1.2, 1.3 megabytes transfer speed. So it's not USB to transfer speed. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be a slowdown attributed to the fact that perhaps the USB adapter or something else is the culprit. It should have been slightly higher, probably around 4 or 5 megabytes. I'm not expecting the full speed due to limitations of the bus on this computer, but it's working, and this is the most important aspect, that you can use a simple USB stick with such a computer. However, one major aspect I would like to mention is the fact that you shouldn't use external hard drives, because they may damage the internal parts. You can supply power through an external cable to this adapter, but I'm not entirely sure if it's going to be damaged or not over long term. So you have to keep that in mind. Right, I think this just about wraps up everything I wanted to present to you about the laptop. Ultimately, is it a model I would recommend? Clearly so. I think that the biggest advantage of it is the wonderful screen. I think it's one of the best screens I have noticed in laptops of this vintage. Only certain ThinkPad top of the line models may be better. So for instance, the 760 IBM ThinkPad, the XL model, I think it was very good, just as well. But for other laptops that are less known, I think this one works perfectly fine. The video chipset is very good. It's not particularly the fastest one, but it's very good. Very good CPU performance, and it runs very cool, so you're not going to be bothered by the sound of the fans, and you don't need to clean as frequently and do other things pertaining to maintenance. Keyboard is excellent for a laptop of this size. I think that the touch feel and the feedback you're going to have on your key presses are fine. The keys being used for cursor positioning are, again, for clicks, are very nice. The track point is feeling fine, good acceleration, good feel. And I think that many aspects are very good. The LED downs, as mentioned, the floppy disk drive that is certainly going to be unusable, and the lack of an USB port in the back. Other than that, I think that the laptop scores fine in terms of multimedia capabilities, very good sound output despite the small speakers. It's a compact laptop, maybe a bit heavy, but ultimately a compact one. Good configuration capabilities in terms of how easy it is to swap and use even the supply memory if you don't have anything else. So I think that it scores very well on many sides, and it makes it quite a good purchase, of course, if you find it at the right price. Of course, you have to keep in mind that the keyboard may be yellowing further if it's going to be subjected to the sun, so it may not be looking entirely pleasing. On the other hand, the plastic is solid, as far as I can tell. It's quite resistant to scratches and dents. It's not going to be rock solid, but anyway, it's not going to be faring as bad as other sorts of laptops I have seen with chassis that can be easily broken. So overall, this laptop is a recommendation if you find it at the right price. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, please subscribe to the channel. I wanted to do more videos pertaining to laptops I had in my collection for quite a while. However, I also diversified and made other videos that may show interesting content to you. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I will be shutting down the system, and as you will see, it's not going to be any issue in doing this because it's perfectly compatible. Okay, shut down perfectly. So I hope you enjoyed the video and have a nice day.